As soon as one talks about romantic poetry or romanticism in literature, the figures that immediately get conjured up before our eyes are those of William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. In short, Wordsworth and Coleridge. Coleridge is not only known as a poet but also a philosopher of some sorts. The same cannot perhaps be said of Wordsworth, though he wrote a lot about theories of poetry. But Coleridge went even beyond theories of poetry and wrote certain things and ideas which greatly anticipated the later developments in philosophy as well as psychology, though he also had borrowed from what existed before him. One of the prime contributions of Coleridge is a kind of reorganization of the theories of imagination that had existed till his time. Till the Middle Ages, there was as such no difference between the terms fancy and imagination. I mean, ever since they had originated, but beginning with the Middle Ages, when there was this neo-Aristotelians and other people, slightly some kind of distinction started to be made between the two terms. But then again, interestingly, this was uneven. In countries like Germany and Italy, imagination was thought to be the lower faculty, whereas fancy was thought to be the higher faculty. Whereas in England, more or less, imagination was always given the higher place and fancy the lower. But still, before Coleridge, we can still say that they were more or less interchangeable. Coleridge, in his 1817 magnum opus, Biographia Literaria, offers a very detailed theory of not only the differences between fancy and imagination, but also the differences between what he perceives as primary imagination and secondary imagination. Coleridge more or less followed the common perception while designating fancy. Fancy, he says, is nothing else than just a mode of memory emancipated from the order of time and place. Look at our day to day usage of the term. Even today, when we talk about something, very exotic, very wild, or kind of out of the order of day to day living, then we say it's fanciful. And then that is, we mean that it is imaginative, but a kind of wild imaginations or fancy items, we say. So, more or less, that thing is there in Coleridge's definition also, that fancy is just a putting together of certain strange kind of ideas which are not related to one another and just making a good show out of it, which will be appreciated by the common folk but not possibly by wise people. Because please also remember that Coleridge had literary writings in context. He was not only talking about human, ordinary human fancy and imagination, but also how they are reflected in creations. So, it says fancy has no other context to play with but fixities and definites. It is just a part of memory, a mode of memory emancipated from the order of time and space, that is, memory remote from its context. Now, coming to imagination, he finds primary imagination to be the vital agent of perception in all human beings, which he precisely defines as the repetition in the finite minds of the infinite I am. It is like Soham of Vedanta philosophy, because there were Kant and Hegel who were however remotely influenced by Vedanta in certain ways. They had some idea. And then Coleridge also had acquainted himself with Indian philosophy to the extent that it was available in his time. In fact, in a certain letter, he has also referred to the figure of Vishnu lying on ocean, on the snake, etc. So he had this kind of idea of what was, you know, said in Indian or Vedantic philosophy as the great existence or cosmic existence continuously repeating Soham, and we have its copy. Coming from the philosophical or theological definition to the practical form, he says, it is the prime agent of all human perception. That is, imagination is that by which we understand things. Otherwise, we won't be able to correlate things. If we are just at the mercy of fancy, then we'll contain certain things disparately in our memory. But then the next thing, that is making sense of things by coordinating them, will not be possible. So the difference between fancy and basically primary imagination, or imagination also we can say, is that fancy is a kind of a mechanical mixture. Take this example, you mix oil with water, there won't be a mixture, perfect mixture. So that is a kind of fancy. But if you mix water with milk, for example, they will mix together. However lighter the milk becomes, or however, no matter how thicker whiter the water becomes, but there will be a perfect mix. This you can take an example of imagination. This you can take as an example of imagination. Then what is secondary imagination? Coleridge says that basically secondary imagination is a heightened form of primary imagination only. The difference between them is not of kind but of degree. That is, say, if primary imagination is imagination, 50 degree or 100 degree, secondary imagination is 180 degree or even 360 degree imagination. But all do not have that. Secondary imagination is possessed by poets, creative writers, greater thinkers who can give something really new. And all obviously do not possess it to the same degree. So secondary imaginations, he uses 3 Ds, like Eliot's 3 Ds in the wasteland, Dattva, Dhyam, Damyata. So he uses 3 Ds: dissolves, diffuses, dissipates, in order to recreate. So at the very first level, there is a difference between fancy and imagination. Then within imagination, there is a difference between primary and secondary imagination. Primary imagination is, in brief, is the prime agent of all human perception. We can understand it as our faculty of understanding itself. And secondary imagination, we can loosely say the poetic power or creative power. There may be poets whom we think to be poets, but they won't be poets as per Coleridge's definition. They may be just merely fanciful, like fancy items you see in different kinds of carnivals, melas, etc. So in this regard, Coleridge would say that a poet like Donne is merely fanciful, comparing lovers with compasses, no connection whatsoever between the two, absolutely, but just putting things together to shock people. So he is merely fanciful, not imaginative, whereas a person like Shakespeare is highly imaginative. So I think this makes the difference clear. But however, remember that like all literary theories or literary criticism rather, there is always a great amount of subjectivity in all those. The same is true in Coleridge's case also. What Coleridge finds to be fanciful, for example, Donne, is not fanciful according to Eliot, because he finds it to be in perfect order, Donne's poem. But then the basic ideas we can retain, nonetheless, we can shift examples, change examples. So Coleridge also, by the way, was quite motivated by the idea of the organic whole. Organic organic whole, which comes from basically Aristotle's concept of a play or a tragedy or a creative work we can extend to be a whole, complete in itself. So, in this regard, I am reminded of another example, that between a bouquet and a natural plant. Just have a look at a flower bouquet. It is made of beautiful flowers, but there is no organic relation between the flowers because they are just plucked and cut and collected from different flower plants, and they are put together. They will fade away, die in 2-3 days, in a short while. Whereas in a natural plant, there is a organic relation between the plant's leaves, the stem and the flower that it grows. So it is a complete whole, a complete natural whole. So according to Coleridge, good creative works are like a plant. So they are imaginative, especially manifestation of secondary imagination, whereas ordinary works like Bollywood masala films, for example, they are merely fanciful. There is no organic relation, no cause and effect relation, nothing except taking us by surprise by throwing different items and one after another. So that is fanciful. So thank you so much for your patient hearing. Of course, please read the relevant sections in Biographia Literaria, especially chapter 13, 14, 15, and in fact 18 also is very important. Thank you.